Chapter 8. Meeting. Stands straight, Samuel. Sees the Wind motioned in Stand Straight's direction. The boy came out from behind the wall and stood by his uncle. They were still far enough from the wooden lodge that it would be hard for anyone to hit them with a musket shot. Sees the Wind lifted his right hand and made a circle above his head. Then he lowered his hand down by his shoulder and dropped it palm down toward the earth. It was the signal for the others to come to him. Together they would move slowly toward the wooden lodge. Stand Straight watched as his uncle began to walk across the open ground between the shelter of the stone wall and the wooden lodge. It was an act of either great courage or foolishness to walk in such a way toward a place where enemies might be waiting. Yet Stand Straight felt a weight lifted from his heart as his uncle began that walk. He followed close behind, and because the other men also trusted the judgment of Seize the Wind, they did the same. Stand Straight saw how his uncle held his bow loosely at his side. The arrow that his index finger held against the bow was no longer knocked on the bowstring, ready to be fired. Stand Straight knew that this did not mean his uncle was unready. A bow in his uncle's hand was more dangerous than a musket, which could only be fired once and then would take many heartbeats to reload. He had watched Seize the Wind pick up a bow and a quiver of arrows and, in less time than it took to clap one's hands 4 times, fire 4 arrows into a target. Now Stand Straight was close enough to the door to see that it had no lock. His uncle pushed open the door, ducked his head under the doorway, and stepped through, with Stand Straight behind him. As Seize the Wind stood there, looking around the small room, none of the white people spoke. No one shouted. No one moved from the place where he sat. Seize the Wind said in a very soft voice. Seize the Wind took another step further into the room, closer to the people on the benches. One man lifted his head and gazed into the eyes of Seize the Wind. Stand Straight saw that this man was the father of his almost brother. He liked this man, who looked at them as if they were looking up at friends. Stand Straight looked next at his almost brother, who sat by the wall. The mother sat there too, and also the little brother. The young man, whose shoulders were very broad and whose face was very red, held his walking stick in his hand. Stand Straight saw, as he knew his uncle had seen, that the stick was the only object in that whole room which might be used as a weapon. Stand Straight gazed at his almost brother, and his almost brother looked back at him. The Indian who stood there, filling the doorway, was the tallest man Samuel had ever seen. The 2 Huron feathers that rose from the cap on his head brushed the roof of the meeting house. Samuel could see that the Indian was at least a head taller than his own father, who was not a small man. Yet that big man had slipped in through the door of the cabin as quietly as a breath of wind crossing the meadow. The big Indian held a bow and arrow in his hand. He stood there calmly, looking around the meeting, peering intently into one face after another. Someone moved behind the tall man. It was an Indian boy. He too was tall and held himself very straight, though his head only came up to the older man's shoulder. And while that tall man looked into the face of Samuel's father, the slender young Indian did something very strange. He lifted up a stone that he held in his right hand, shut one eye, and then squinted through the hole in the stone as if it were a spyglass. He surveyed the room and then looked through the hole directly at Samuel. Samuel felt afraid at first, but as the small boy continued to look steadily at him, as if trying to understand him, Samuel felt the fear leave his own heart. Then father, as if he too felt that tension leaving his son, released his grip. Samuel opened his hand and placed his walking stick on the floor. Stand Straight was surprised. Never before had he seen so many white people sit so long without speaking. He had heard it said that the whites were born talking and never stopped until they died. They spoke so much that they often forgot how to hear. But these white people were not talkers. They were listeners. And looking through his eyes stone, he saw what they were listening to. They were listening to hear the voice of Kitsiniwask, the Creator, that voice which is hidden in each person's heart. They looked as if they would sit as long as it would take the sun to move the width of 2 hands across the sky. Nidoba, someone said, my friend. It was a brown-haired Bostoniac man who looked to be of middle years and not of a great height. Nidoba, Seize the Wind replied, speaking softly. The brown-haired man stood, a smile on his face. He walked over to Seize the Wind and held out his hand. Seize the Wind, the hand of the friendship. Seize the Wind took the hand of friendship that was offered to him and shook it. Kwai Nadoba, said the brown-haired man, speaking in Abenaki. Then he continued in French. My name is Nisbet. You are welcome here. Nisbet, are there weapons here? Seize the Wind asked in French. None. the brown-haired man called Nisbet answered. "All here are the people of peace." He motioned with his right hand toward an empty bench. "Join us." Seize the Wind turned and leaned out the door to carefully place his bow and his arrows against the outside wall of the meeting house. Then he went to sit on the bench. One after another, all the Abenakis did the same with their weapons and took empty seats among the Bostoniac men and women. The last to enter and sit down, looking as nervous as two deer walking into the lair of a panther, were Richard and hungry Frenchmen. They all sat in silence.